I loved Laila. Like for me, she represents like a challenge to the Western stereotype of a repressed Afghan woman.
Laila is sort of the kind of a young woman that I grew up around, someone who had every expectation of being as educated as her male cousin and her brother. It was for those women that the cycles of war and violence and turmoil and oppression, it was on them that the toll that was exacted was the most onerous.
Hi, Khaled. How are
Hi.
you?
Hi, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I just want to say thank you so much for joining me today to talk about your unbelievably powerful novel, A Thousand Splendid Suns, which is set in Afghanistan in the period between 1959 to 2003. I was so moved by this book, and I'm just so delighted to talk to you. But at the same time, quite sad, I guess, because I know that this conversation will touch on some very difficult topics, not least with the ongoing horrors that are still happening in Afghanistan. And, you know, not only as a novelist, but also as an activist and a philanthropist, I know that you'll be very well placed to tell us something about the current reality in Afghanistan and the current reality for Afghan women and girls in particular. What perhaps makes your book especially pertinent today is that it's a story of female courage and endurance, and that's something that I felt very connected to, and I thought there was just some very beautiful solidarity found between women in extremely difficult circumstances, and in that sense I found it a very beautiful read. So I'm so happy to be here today talking to you and getting to dive into all of this. So thank you again.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. It's a pleasure to talk to you. And Afghanistan has receded from the headlines, and so I appreciate this opportunity to talk about Afghanistan as a whole, but also particularly about Afghan women and girls who are, as you alluded to, facing old challenges all over again.
I'd like to start by saying that you grew up in Afghanistan in the 60s and 70s. And I'd love to hear about your Afghanistan.
Oh, vastly different country. In some ways, I feel deeply fortunate to have lived during those years because I got to see those final few years before the watershed events that led to where we are now. I left before the Soviet invasion, at a time and I lived in Kabul, when Kabul was a thriving cosmopolitan city where it was, for Afghanistan at least, which, let's face it, was always a conservative, religious, and an impoverished nation. But by those standards, Kabul was a very progressive city. I grew up around very powerful women who were quite vocal and opinionated, who were professionals and well-educated, who were quite, well-spoken on world politics and so forth. So it was a vastly different country. I saw, women were worked in the government. I had family members, women who were doctors, who were literature professors at the university, and so it's really quite a different environment. And it's an era that I had hoped would return, after 2001. And in some fashion, it sort of did, but here we are now in 2024, and it's back to a very grim square one.
The title of the book, A Thousand Splendid Suns, it sounds glorious and it evokes a lot of beauty. And I think that's probably more resonant to your Afghanistan and how maybe you remember it at that time. But it's a very harrowing story as well. Was that juxtaposition purposeful? Hearing you talk about your Afghanistan, I wonder whether that relates more to your experience of it than of the story of what happens to the characters in the book.
Well, yes. I mean, my personal memories of Afghanistan are unlike generations, one or two generations of children that followed me, are rather quite happy. I remember a peaceful country that was at peace with itself, at peace with its neighbors, where it was an impoverished country, but people would leave their doors unlocked, and it was a good place to grow up. And it's maybe one of the worst places now to grow up, and particularly if you grow up as a girl. So this juxtaposition of beauty and brutality has been part of the Afghan story now for decades. And when I went back to Afghanistan in 2003, it was more stark than ever. I saw traces of beauty everywhere, and the hospitality of the people, and how gentle they were, and the stark beauty of the land itself. With Afghanistan is a gorgeous country. It's a stunning country. Most people think it's just caves and mountains. It is not. It is a beautiful country geographically. It's stunning, and it had a thriving tourist industry back in the 1970s. But it also have been cycles of brutality and violence and turmoil and displacement, really essentially since the Soviet invasion, and it's still in significant ways still ongoing.
Let's go back to the beginning of the book, where we meet Mariam, and she's one of the two female characters which are at the heart of the story. Now, when she's just a child, her mother Nana tells her, like a compass needle that points north, a man's accusing finger always finds a woman, always. I mean, it's pretty bleak, And as a child who's a harami or illegitimate, perhaps this applies even more to Mariam than other women and girls.
It does. I mean, certainly she's being born a girl in Afghanistan is tough enough, but being born an illegitimate girl is is particularly difficult.
Yeah.
But also, she says that to Mariam way before the Taliban and the civil wars and so on and so forth. And part of what I mean to convey there, it has always been difficult to be a woman in Afghanistan. And when I grew up in Kabul, it's an urban hub. It's a more progressive sort of place. But in many parts of the country, particularly out in the provinces, life for Afghan women has always been a struggle. They've always fought for their autonomy. This goes back to the early 20th century. We had an Afghan king who in the 1920s tried to emancipate women and banned the burqa and mandated education and university education for all women. And that met with a severe backlash in the provinces where, traditional religious views are the prevailing ones. And he ended up going in exile. So I think what Nana is saying there is that it's a very difficult thing to be a woman, especially in this place. And you being a legitimate child, Mariam, are at a particular disadvantage.
Right. There's a pivotal moment in the story where Mariam turns up unexpectedly at her father Jalil's house. And she's hoping to be welcomed into his family home. And it's a very heartbreaking moment because I think that's when it really hits her how she really has no agency in Afghan society, and that her whole future will kind of be determined, by a man that she has to marry against her will. And it's a really kind of dark coming of age moment. Like, tell me about these scenes. Like what is the reality of the world that she encounters at this point?
Well, I mean, she lives under this kind of a fantasy that she's a meaningful member, possibly of a family, that she has a father, that she has legitimacy, that she belongs to the world, that she has a place in the world. And when she goes to her father's house, on her birthday, no less, and he essentially shuns her, she ends up sleeping the night outside his door on the street. It's a brutal realization of how she actually fits into his life, and that the fact that she actually doesn't have any real agency in her life, and that her fate's going to be determined not by her dreams, by her hopes, by her aspirations, however modest they may be, by somebody else. And in fact, in short order, she's married off to Rasheed, who turns out to be a complicated guy who ends up being a pivotal character in the book that brutalizes Mariam, and is sort of a stand-in in some ways for much of what we're seeing in Afghanistan today, particularly since the Taliban have returned.
Mm. Now let's talk, because there's a lot of juxtaposition in this book overall. So I need to now jump into talking a little bit about Layla,
Mm.
because her being the second major female character, you know, when we first meet her, she's independent, she's passionate, she has a boyfriend who adores her, and a father who encourages her that she can be anything that she wants to be. Um, and I loved Lila. Like for me, she represents like a challenge to the Western stereotype of a repressed Afghan woman. Was that your intention?
Yeah, because I think so much of the particularly in the West, of understanding of Afghan women was really came after September 11th, when the
Mm,
world discovered, what the Taliban were doing in Afghanistan, and sort of the burqa became a visceral, iconic symbol of female oppression in Afghanistan. But the actual picture, when you look at it more in a more granular level, was much more complicated than that. There were, as I alluded to earlier, an entire spectrum of how women lived in Afghanistan. Yes, in the provinces, life for Afghan women was very difficult. Yes, they wore the burqa even back in the 60s, 70s, and well before that.
hmm
But there was a real
Progression.
drive towards progression, a real
Mm,
drive towards autonomy and education and so forth, particularly in urban hubs like Kabul. And Laila belongs to that. Laila is sort of the kind of a young woman that I grew up around, someone who had every expectation of being as educated as her male cousin and her brother. And it was for those women that the cycles of war and violence and turmoil and oppression, it was on them that the toll that was exacted was the most onerous, because they actually grew up with legitimate hopes of becoming some professionals, becoming educated, and
mm.
determining their own destinies. And when that was taken from them, it was a devastating blow.
Right, because there is a big generational age difference between Mariam and Lila in the book. And can you speak about the different ways they perceive their places as women in society when they meet? And how do they influence each other over time? Because I feel like their bond is incredibly powerful. And as the story progresses, it becomes stronger and stronger, almost like a mother daughter relationship. I'd love to hear you speak about the different ways that they perceive their place in society.
Yeah, I mean, as I was writing the book, I wasn't really sure what is the central. I knew it was between Mariam and Allah, but I couldn't quite understand what was the central dynamic of the relationship. And once it clicked for me, then that became the beacon. That became the
Mm,
thing that everything revolved around. And I understood that what this is really a book about motherhood.
yeah.
It's a book, they become really a sort of, Mariam becomes a proxy mother for Laila, whose own mother in many ways is really absent because she's lost in her own grief of the loss of her sons. And Laila becomes the proxy daughter for Mariam, who is incapable of bearing children. When they meet, Mariam is from a village. She's uneducated. She's illiterate. She has very, very modest aspirations from life. She almost seems apologetic about the place she occupies in the
Mm,
world. Whereas Laila is driven. Laila is ambitious. Laila has expectations of life, and those expectations are crushed. And it's how they heal each other, how they nurture each other, how they help each other through these respective disappointments that really I think is the heart of the book, and why
totally.
readers are drawn to this relationship and to
Yeah,
this book. Yeah.
it's beautiful. It's definitely the reason why I was so drawn to it, is the connection between these two women. Um,
It's what kept me writing it. I mean,
yeah,
I absolutely, I became so invested in that relationship.
yeah.
I mean, I thought about them all the time. When I was at the grocery line store, when I was
Mm.
driving somewhere, when I was with my children, I thought about this relationship, this sort of this mother-daughter relationship that came out of the unlikeliest places as rivals
I was
married to the
just
same
about to
brutal
say,
man, you
yeah.
know, and that was the heart that kept me driving, that kept me
Mm.
writing.
Okay, so let's talk about this brutal man, Rasheed. He's the central male character, and he's the one who Mariam is first forcibly married to, and then Laila. He's much older than both of them. He's a brute by any standards. He's a traditionalist. He's a bully, and before too long, he's also violent. And there's this really gut wrenching scene with Mariam when Mariam and Layla try to flee his violence and seek the help of a stranger, and they kind of get returned to their oppressor. And of course, this is the reality for a lot of abused women under the Taliban, and there's kind of no escape. Um, and while these scenes are really important, I'm wondering from your experience and from you talking about how invested you were in these characters and not being able to stop thinking about them, like, were these really difficult to write?
Yeah, they were difficult. if
Yeah.
if yeah, because if you in the writing process don't feel the emotional upheaval, then the reader never will. So I was invested in this dynamic from the get-go. And Rashid was, I think, in some ways the most complicated character to write, because I didn't want to turn him into this mustache twirling villain. I think in many ways he's a victim of his own upbringing, in a cultural tradition where boys are taught at a very young age what their role is in society and what the role of women is.
Mm.
It's important to state that the Taliban did not bring into Afghanistan a brand new radical ideology that already had its roots in Afghan culture,
Culture, yeah.
not throughout, but in many places in Afghanistan. Certainly not in my experience, personal experience, but I was quite aware that women had struggled for autonomy and essentially lived the way the Taliban are dictating life to women now. Back then, decades before, and in that culture. And you can see it to the Taliban arise from this. A woman is seen as sort of the holds the mantle of honor of a family,
Mm.
and her chastity and her honor are to be protected at all cost. And distressingly, most importantly, has to be protected from herself, because in that point of view, women are viewed as sort of irresponsible creatures that cannot be trusted with these important things and have to be sort of protected from themselves. And so, Rashid vocalizes that in many ways when he hands Mariam a burqa and says, "This is for your own good. You may not realize this, but this is for your own protection, and you'll wear it because I know better how to protect you than you know yourself." So Rashid has his roots in a kind of a very traditional, conservative, tribal tradition of how women are viewed and how women are raised, and which is offers a woman a very, very limited set of options, which is to stay at
Mm.
home and raise children and tend to the family household, and essentially have no meaningful, significant participation in the public life.
Right, because he's been conditioned and that's kind of all he knows in a
That's all he
way.
knows. Yeah.
Do you feel empathy for him?
If I didn't feel empathy for him, it'd be hard to write for him. And in some ways, I
Hmm.
feel, I feel, I feel really sorry for him. I do. He's kind. He's sort of a victim of how he was raised himself. But at the end
Right.
of the day, he what he does is so unforgivable that I have very
It's
mixed.
almost like mixed feelings, yeah.
Yeah, it's mixed feelings. Exactly.
Mm.
Exactly.
Um, there's another quote from Mariam's mother, Nana, which really struck me. And she says, "A man's heart is a wretched, wretched thing. It isn't like a mother's womb. It won't bleed, it won't stretch to make room for you." but you actually challenge that. You know, Laila's father is her greatest champion, and even Mariam's father, Jalil, he kind of receives some kind of redemption, at the end of the novel. Was it a challenge for you to portray rounded male characters in a book that's primarily about the oppression of women by men?
Yes, because I don't want to convey the idea that Afghanistan is a uniformly misogynistic country, because it's simply not true. I repeat what I said earlier. Where I grew up in the 1970s, there were a lot of men that were advocates for women's rights, and so Laila's father is sort of a stand-in for the kind of urban, progressive, forward-thinking men that were in Afghanistan in the 70s are in Afghanistan today. It is important for me in a way to portray a sort of a diversity and the sort of the spectrum
Yeah.
of beliefs and views that exist in Afghanistan, because it is a complicated country. There's nothing homogenous about it, and so to the best that I could, I tried to say, well, yes, there's Rasheed, but there's also Laila's father, who
Yeah.
advocates for the education of his daughter, and says, you can get married anytime, but you need to get educated first because your
First,
country
yeah.
needs you. And
Mm.
and his words today are proving so prophetic and sort of kind of heartbreakingly so, because education is so central, and now
Yeah.
that's one of the real challenges in Afghanistan.
Yeah, it's really being threatened. What I think this book does so well is really open a window on what it's really like to be a woman in Afghanistan. And I think it's quite risky, for a man to write from the perspective of a woman, and a big responsibility, with such a difficult subject as this. Like, how did you make sure that the story was as authentic as possible?
Well, I mean, I struggled with that for quite a bit, because I was very self-conscious about what you just said. That it's very. I'm a man. I don't occupy the emotional arena of a woman. I don't have their experience, and I think the more I thought about that, the more stilted and self-conscious my writing became, and the more I was disenchanted with it. But at some point, I spent so much time with these two women, and I have known versions of Mariam and Laila all my life in Afghanistan. I lived next door to Mariam. I lived next door to Laila everywhere I went. So it's not like they were like prototypes of women that I had known. But the more time I spent with them, those particular characters, and got to know them, their inner desires, their dreams, their aspirations, their fears, their disappointments, I was able to sort of understand them better and stop thinking them in italics as Afghan women, but really as human beings, and sort of absolve myself of this responsibility of, like, I'm a man writing about a woman, but I'm really writing about these two human beings. And once that sort of watershed moment happened, I noticed that the writing popped, and the characters came
Just
to life,
flowed, yeah.
and the story
Mm.
felt, heartfelt, and so that was kind of a real watershed moment in the writing of this book.
Mm. I love that. How long did it take you to get to that place of like real confidence with these characters?
Um, at least for most of the first draft.
Okay.
In most of the first draft, and then and some of the second draft. But by the time I was writing, but finishing the second draft, I felt like I really knew
You're
these, at least
connected, yeah.
these two women for sure. I knew who they
Okay.
were, and so how the book, as I got to know them, how the book had to end. Became clear to me, because I didn't know how the book was going to end as I was writing it. I knew there would be a big act of sacrifice at the end, but I don't know
Mm.
who would do it, and how it would play out. But as I got to know these two women, the whole book just kind of unfurled and opened itself to me.
Mm. And the story ends on, somewhat a hopeful note, with the fall of the Taliban regime. And there was a period of hope between 2001 and 2021. Like, how do you think things might work out for Lila's children?
Well, today things are dramatically different, but let me just talk first about the 20 years after 2001, because it was a period of transformation. I'm very sober to the challenges the country faced during those 20 years. I mean, Afghans had they were there was economic struggles. Afghans had legitimate grievances against the way the Westerners behaved in Afghanistan and the way they conducted business. They had serious grievances, quite justifiably, against their own governments and the rampant culture of corruption and violence and so forth. But undoubtedly, once Laila's children were growing up in that age, they would have experienced an Afghanistan where there was a bit of a rebirth. It's very easy to remember all the problems that Afghanistan faced the last 20 years before the Taliban arrival. But the fact is, there's a lot of good happened also. Thousands of kilometers of roads were rebuilt, thousands of schools were rebuilt, millions of children returned to school. 35 to 40% of them girls. Women became so active in societal life, at least in urban centers. Let's not forget they served in the lower house of the parliament. They were visible in the media. They worked in the health sector, in education. They were mayors. They were provincial governors. And there was significant drops in maternal mortality and infant mortality. So there was really good things that did. So Laila's children would have benefited from some of those progress that we saw in the last 20 years. The real question is what happens to all that now, and so far the way it has played out is that is quite sobering.
Mm. I guess finally, given where things are today, with 3 million people on the brink of starvation, no education, for girls beyond sixth grade, women excluded from work and society, music banned. I know that the question, like most people will be left with, is there anything we can do to help?
Um, that is really, really the important question. One
Mm.
thing I know is that we can't stay silent because Afghan women themselves have not stayed silent. Despite the threat of detention and imprisonment and beatings and worse, they've gone online and protested. They've taken to cities across the country and protested and demanded that the rights that were stripped from them be restored. They've refused to play the role of helpless, silent victims, and they've shown a real indomitable spirit of agency and courage, as they always
Absolutely.
have. So it's important to, and that's why I appreciate this hour, it's important to express solidarity with them and raise our voice and advocate for the right to education, to work, and protections from abuse. But at the end of the day, tweeting and online slogans and hashtags are not going to restore the rights of women in Afghanistan. And what we really need is policy change inside Afghanistan. And that raises the really complicated and thorny question of how or if to engage with the Taliban. And I think that's what the world is dealing with now. And there's like two schools of thoughts. One school of thought says, look, the Taliban have proven who they are. Their track record on human rights has been well established. And I say all this as my personal view, not as a representative of any kind of a UN agency. These are my personal views. But they say that the world should continue to shun and ostracize the Taliban until they demonstrate legitimately their commitment to the obligations of a state, among which the protection of the rights of women and girls is central. The other school of thought recognizes all that, but says that we should at least engage, at least in a conversation that falls short of legitimizing or endorsing the Taliban, but one in which financial assistance and the unfreezing of some assets can be used as a bargaining chip to secure from the Taliban, safeguards about the protection of the rights of women and girls. So that's where we are, and that's the dialogue that's being had around the world. My personal view is that while the world sort of wrings its hands and decides what to do, it's important to not forget that millions of Afghans are suffering. You can't throw out the baby with the bathwater. There's a country where 29 million people need humanitarian assistance. Half of them are children. 15 million people in Afghanistan don't know where the next meal is coming from. 70% of households don't have access to clean drinking water. Unemployment is skyrocketing. So, we need to come up with creative strategies to at least curb a humanitarian catastrophe in Afghanistan, which frankly is already on the way, and see to it that Afghan households have at least access to basic goods like food, water, shelter, and healthcare. So that's kind of where we are.
Right. Khaled, thank you so much for all your time. I've absolutely loved talking to you and diving deeper into A Thousand Splendid Suns. And I'd also like to add to everybody listening that we've posted a list of resources on service95.com for those who'd like to learn more and are looking for ways to help. And that also includes a link to your foundation, Khaled. And there's also some really incredible stories from Afghan women, including amazing writers, artists, and activists. Khaled, thank you so much. And thank you so much to everybody listening. Please check out those links. And it's been a real pleasure. And I really appreciate your time. Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Dua. It was a joy to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.